a little frustrating. Like Danny asked a question a few minutes ago, and part of this is because of my own philosophical ignorance. But like the question that Danny asked Blake a few minutes ago was like, "Well, do you think we ought to obey God's commands?" And Blake said, "Wow, I never thought about that." Which I find.
Wait, no, that's not. That wasn't the question.
Yeah, I don't know if that's what he said. He said it like
that's
that.
what I heard, but maybe I misunderstood it.
Better.
Wait, what?
Good?
Sorry,
I don't know. It seems obvious to me that we want to obey God's commands.
Yeah,
that's because you're
frustrated
a
me.
Catholic.
Okay.
Yeah,
He's joking.
Okay.
That's a joke. That's
No,
a
I
joke.
know.
I always make at least one Catholic
I like
joke when I talk to him.
I
Yeah,
get it.
his councils and his popes tell him he has to do something. He's obligated. That's how he's used to. So God must be the same way.
No, but
isn't it the same way?
no, that's not what Blake said.
I mean, it's not the same way.
Yeah, just to be clear, when Blake didn't say that that we, of course, we ought to do what God commands us, but that's not what Blake was saying. Blake, you remember the question was? It was something like, is it
Yeah, the
better?
question was more like, is it always good for a person to obey God, essentially? And this isn't about their obligations. It's like, is the world always better when someone obeys God? That's what it amounts to. And my answer is,
How is the answer not yes though? Like,
well, because I can at least imagine a scenario. Go to a particular city, and God and then God knows that when He commands someone to go to a particular city, the person is actually going to go to Jerusalem, and God wanted them to go to Jerusalem. So in disobeying God, it's actually a good thing happens. So I actually, I had to think about it for a second, but in the end, I think that sometimes disobeying God can result in good state affairs. Yeah.
Well, but
it's just like sophistry, though. I mean, that means what God intended to happen happened, and therefore you did the will of God.
Yeah, but I think we're equivocating between God making that state of affairs good versus him. Like, okay, when God told Jonah to go to Nineveh, like Jonah ought to have obeyed and gone to Nineveh. Like that would have been an easy way. Jonah said, "No, I'm not going to do that." Tries to go to Tarshish. God does make it work out to where Jonah ends up going to Nineveh. But like, this is where it's like God does get his way in the end, but he probably would have preferred Jonah to go to Nineveh.
Suppose God told him about that plan way later. The question is for me, when Jonah reflects and said, "What does he think? Does he think he made a mistake? Does he think that he should have done differently?" And all things considered, Jonah should arrive at the conclusion that he didn't make a mistake. Right?
Danny, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mike. Finish.
That's it. That Jonah, he knows all the facts, is not going to believe that he should have done differently.
Okay, so here's something I want to try to get out to you, Danny, because I feel like a lot of what you say, when it seems to carry any force at all, is when you start mixing up different kinds of ought. Okay, so I hear you mixing up and saying like plausible sounding things, because on the one hand, first you're talking about a hypothetical imperative. Then another time you're talking about what's good, the good thing to do, and just assuming that it's what we ought to do. And then other times you're using it in a language where it seems like you have to be talking about deontology. And then it's all getting mixed up.
The reason why I'm not equivocating is because I'm never going to be referring to categorical norms. I think they're incoherent.
Sorry, I have to say one quick thing. Do you realize that means you're basically not talking to Christians anymore?
No, I don't think Christians could. Look, if you're going to die on the hill of categoricity, then that's fine. Then Christianity is incoherent, like with respect to at least their meta-ethical framework. But the point is that I think if Jonah found out, if God told him his plan, right? Jonah is going to be rationally compelled to think that he should have not done differently, and I just want to make sure that that's agreed upon.
I'm interested to see AP. Do you understand? That what Danny is saying is that in order for the way he's presenting his argument, all that there really are hypothetical imperatives, which is to say there's nothing that's just full stop good. They're the only things that are good, or the only things that we ought to do there's no full stop right thing to do.
Oh, really?
The only things that are the right things to do are the things that you should do given a particular goal that you state. Whereas Christians, of course, if you're a Catholic, you're going to believe that there are things that you just ought to do full stop. It's not like if you want to, create more humans in the world, then you should do this, or if you want to taste strawberries, then you should do this. Those are the only kind of oughts that Danny recognizes. He doesn't recognize a full-blown moral categorical. You just ought to do it. It's the right thing to do.
With Christianity,
huh?
Those are in conflict with Christianity.
Categorical imperatives are in conflict with Christianity.
Yeah, I just take them being coherent, right? But the idea is that the reason why we can make sense of a pro tanto obligation or pro tanto ought here is because of the ignorance of the person that has heard God's commands. The person is ignorant of the good, and that's why they have the obligation.
They have what?
That's why they have the obligation, because they're ignorant of the good.
Well, you're assuming that a person's obligations are on the basis of producing the most good thing, and what I'm telling you is that Christians are deontologists. They think that things, or some of them are threshold deontologists, but that means that they think that there are obligations that don't necessarily line up with the most good thing. So, for instance, let me give you an example. Christians have an obligation not to murder. Now, if I'm confronted with baby Hitler, maybe I can produce a better world by murdering him, and it would be a pro toto better world. But guess what? My obligation is to not murder him.
The point is that you understand my ignorance point, right? If you're ignorant of the good, you could have obligations that are, look, given what I knew, this is what I should have done. But now that I know everything, that's not what I should have done. Right? You understand that?
When you're saying what you should have done, you're saying because you're thinking like a consequentialist.
No,
you're thinking, but you are.
I'm not presupposing anything like that.
You actually are, I believe. I would insist that you are.
What, did I appeal to a consequence?
Yes, because when you say, "Oh, I realize that I shouldn't," you're talking about because it produced a worse state of affairs.
That doesn't imply consequentialism. right?
It does. It's because the consequences being a worse state of affairs are what make the action
I
wrong.
take consequentialism to say that some act is good or bad or right or wrong or obligatory or not in virtue of an effect of or some kind of result.
Yes, and based on think about what you just said. Think about what you just said. The person realized that they should have done something different, and that's on the basis of them realizing the consequence wasn't what they wanted.
How does that imply that?
Well, what kind of revelation are you talking about? Like, what did they realize?
God says, this was my plan, right? My plan all along was for you to disobey me. And then Jonah thinks to himself, oh, well, I'm glad I didn't do differently.
Jonah thinks to himself, I'm glad I didn't do differently. Can you, say the whole thing for me? What are you trying to say?
Okay, the point is that you're saying, like, take the Jonah case as an example of that Caleb offered. Jonah disobeys God. And let's just stipulate that it brought about God's plan, right? In that God disobeyed.
Yep.
And now, the obligations that Jonah had, I mean, he had obligations. I'm fine with saying he had obligations, given his ignorance, given the little that he knew, and so it might. But when he's not ignorant of the plan, right, then he's going to reflect and actually be thankful that he did not do differently, right? There's not going to be a in which he made a mistake.
Wonderful. Okay, let's tease this out, because again, I think there's some conflation going on here. Even if Jonah comes to find that in the end his disobedience of God resulted in a better state of affairs, he's not going to look back and think, therefore, I ought to have disobeyed God in that situation just because it results in a better state of affairs. Hold on. That he can recognize that the ultimate state of affairs that occurred from his disobedience ended up being a better state of affairs, while simultaneously acknowledging that what he did was wrong.
No, and that doesn't make any sense, right? The reason why it doesn't make any sense is that we're stipulating that God's plan is the pro toto good.
Yep.
Okay, and that Jonah recognizes that. Okay,
yep.
And he knows that if he had done differently, it would undermine the pro toto good. So he's not going to look at his action in a way where he's going to think, I should have done differently.
Yeah, you're assuming consequentialism, because on deontological ethics, it's enough. Your obligations do not ride on what makes a proto. Hey, hold on, Danny. Your obligations, if you're a deontologist, do not ride on what make for a pro toto good. It's irrelevant what the pro toto good is on deontology.
No, look, the point is that we are stipulating here, and by stipulating this, we're not implying consequentialism. Aren't we stipulating that that God's plan is the highest good?
Sure. Yeah. Well, no. When you say the highest good, it's higher than any of our plans, but it's not like going to produce the best possible world.
Imply consequentialism?
Huh?
Does that imply consequentialism?
Does what imply consequentialism?
By stipulating that God's plan is the highest good, does that imply consequentialism?
What do you mean by What do you mean by highest good?
Meaning that like a pro toto good, like all things considered, it's God's plan.
Okay, I can work with that.
Okay.
So now ask the question with pro toto good.
Yeah, because pro toto is the highest good, pro toto good. That's fine, right? The idea here.
No, ask your question, but use the word pro toto good.
Yeah. Is it assuming that in saying that God's plan is pro toto good, that we're assuming consequentialism?
No.
Okay, good. Now, can Jonah find out the pro toto good?
Sure.
Okay. Does that assume consequentialism?
Nope.
Okay, good. So no consequentialism. Now, if Jonah recognizes and finds out he's no longer ignorant of the pro toto good,
yep,
and thinks that it's pro toto good, then he's going to look back at his actions and realize that if he had done differently, the pro toto good would have been undermined because his disobedience is part of bringing about the pro toto good.
You got it. Keep going.
All right. So then he should have not done differently.
Oh, it should have. You just made the transition to should.
Well, you didn't follow that? Look, the point
is... I followed it entirely. You were talking about the pro toto good, and you're talking about how it's a better state of affairs. But where do you get the assumption that just because it's a better state of affairs that it's what he should have done?
Because you've agreed that that Jonah has recognized the pro toto good.
Yep, he has.
Okay. You recognize that logically implies that if he believes that he was instrumental in bringing about the pro toto good, then and if he believes that if he wasn't instrumental in that, there's a counterfactual that the pro toto good would have not been realized.
Yes,
then
you said
that
all
would be not as good.
Yes, you said all that. That's exactly right. But you're still, I think you're like stuck in your own worldview, and you haven't taken seriously or considered seriously an alternative perspective, which is the deontological. Let me hear Jimmy real quick.
Wait, am I assuming consequentialism? Because you can take back that claim.
No, you are assuming consequentialism.
Where did I assume consequentialism?
At the very end, when you made the shift from this is a better outcome to therefore this is what I ought to do. That's when you made the shift to consequentialism.
How does that imply consequentialism?
Because consequentialism is the view that you ought to do what results in a given consequence. The consequence is what is the right maker.
No, now you've already said, okay, now if anything, if this is true, then you're guilty of it too, because you're saying that Jonah was instrumental for an end. Is that consequentialism?
I think that God is a consequentialist.
Okay,
so God, real quick. Real quick. Hold on, Danny. Let me clarify here. When I say God is a consequentialist, what I mean is I don't think God has obligations, but I think God has a nature of loving and prioritizing the good. So God has a tendency to produce good things. That's what I mean. That's what I mean there. But real quick, what I need you to understand is go back to the baby Hitler thing. this is going to help you understand that a Christian looking at baby Hitler isn't going, even if I knew that murdering baby Hitler was going to result in a pro-toto better world, my obligation remains not to murder that baby.
Then you're equivocating on the obligation, because presumably an obligation is what you should do, considering what you know. Okay. And if it's the case that you know that your obligation would have undermined the pro-toto good, then that's just, what does that even mean?
It's clear to me. I mean,
Yeah, no, that's not clear to me. So go ahead and tell me what it means to say that you have an obligation that undermines the pro-toto good.
I think that there are categorical rights. There are categorical
In
right
other
things.
words,
They
No,
again,
look, that translates that you have an obligation to bring about evil, pro-toto evil. That's the
No.
implication, right? If your obligation undermines the pro-toto good, then it supports the pro-toto evil.
if you're say that
What
again,
does it mean
say
to
that.
say
Wait,
that
say
there's
that
an
again. What?
obligation? For what it means to say that your obligation undermines the pro-toto good is that in carrying out the obligation, you support or you bring about the pro-toto evil.
Yeah, no, I'm not. So really, what this boils down to is two different perspectives on whether you should murder baby Hitler.
Did you understand what I said?
Real quick. Hold on. This is really what it boils down to.
No, did you understand what I said? That's critical that you understood what I said.
Okay, repeat it again, please.
That what it means to undermine that for your obligation to undermine the good, and here when I'm using the word good, I mean pro-toto. Okay.
Wait, for my what to undermine the good?
If your obligation undermines the good, then that means the obligation supports evil in the pro-toto sense.
If it undermines the good, what do you mean by undermines the good?
If your obligation makes it such that the good is not realized.
Well, just because a good isn't realized doesn't mean an evil is realized.
It's pro-toto.
So
then that means that if the good was not realized pro-toto, then what has been realized is the opposite of the pro-toto good, which is just the opposite of pro-toto good is pro-toto evil.
No, that's not right.
Look, it's either that what should be actualized isn't, right? And that implies that.
No, I don't affirm that. No, I'm not saying it should be actualized. I don't even know it should be actualized.
That's what you think good means. To say that something pro-toto good is that it should occur, all things considered. Right?
No, I don't use that language of
all this entire time.
I don't use that language of like a good state is what should occur. I don't know if I.
If God is telling you that,
What?
what are you talking about now? Like, you've been fine with this stipulation for. I remember in the beginning I talked about all things considered. This shouldn't happen. All things considered, this should happen, and that just means pro-toto good and pro-toto evil.
Say that again.
Remember, when we started with the problem of evil, I said the sense of evil that we're talking about is the pro-toto evil, which is to say that that event that's pro-toto evil is an event that should not occur, all things considered. That was stipulated a long time ago.
And Blake, I thought you agreed that with the value.
Yeah, so it's confusing because on the one hand we want to talk about what a person should do, and then here I guess we're talking about like a state of affairs that should obtain. Hold on.
Yeah, but when we discussed like the definition of value, valuable.
Yeah, I mean, so we can talk about. So it's kind of like the world should always be better, no matter how good the world is. Based on how you're using the words, the world should be better, and I don't think I go in for that.
Earlier you said God's plan is pro-toto good. If that doesn't mean that all things considered, God's plan should be realized, then I don't know what you mean.
I mean, when I talk about good, I think I'm thinking like things that like love and joy and like the valuable things.
Wait, could it be true simultaneously that God's plan is pro-toto good, but all things considered it shouldn't occur?
If under what condition?
Does it make sense to you? Can these be true simultaneously? That God's plan is pro-toto good, but all things considered, it should not occur?
I don't use that language of it should not occur like full stop. When I use the word should, it's always for me in the context of persons doing things. It's obligations for persons. I don't think in terms of.
Do you think God's plan should occur?
Again, that's if I accepted the language of like the plan should occur, then I would have to go on to say that no matter how good the world is, it should be better. And I don't like that language. I don't think that's the right way to talk.
So answer the question, right? Is it true or false? God's plan should occur.
False. Or it's more like
okay.
it's kind of like the statement about the bald king of France. I don't think it refers. I mean, it fails. You're making an assumption in the statement that is false.
And
the assumption is that states of affairs have the property of like they should obtain or shouldn't obtain. And I think that's a category error.
Okay, so you think sin? So when the pastor says, you shouldn't sin, right?
No, that's the obligation of a person.
Or sin shouldn't occur. So now, if the pastor says sin shouldn't occur,
mm-hmm.
Do you understand what that means?
I interpret it, when I hear a pastor say something like, speaking loosely, I interpret him as saying a person should not sin.
Okay, so then when I say that God's plan should occur, what does that mean to you? Nothing?
That's weird. That makes no sense to me.
But Blake,
you can say it's good for God's plan to.
So you don't think events can be good or bad in the sense?
No, I think they can be good and bad.
Yeah,
but I don't think events can be events implicator or states events implicator can be right or wrong.
Like, is there any kind of world that God can't create outside of like logical impossibility? Like, does God's goodness prevent God from creating any certain kind of world? In your view,
does God's goodness prevent him from creating? Yeah, I think so. I think it prevents him from.
So could God create a world where people are just being tortured for all of eternity with no like salvation, no redemption, nothing good coming out of it?
Probably not.
Okay, so why would God? So God ought not to create that world, or God shouldn't create that world?
No, it's not ought. It's just it's such a bad world that it's incompatible with God's nature.
So God has to choose states of affairs that are compatible with His nature.
when you say God has to, God has a nature to do a particular thing.
So
in
God
his
will
na-
choose states of affairs that are compatible with his
Yeah,
nature.
that's right. God will.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So I think so maybe that's better language to use then. So then I guess the question we could just rephrase it then is God, by God allowing certain states of affairs, does that mean that those states of affairs are consistent? So by God allowing like murder or something or rape, is God's allowance of that consistent with his nature?
Right. That's the good question to ask. Yep. And I think that's the question in the problem of evil, and that's what theodicies are addressing.
So you would say yes, it is, that it is consistent with God's nature to
Yeah,
rape
I think that all sorts of like suffering and things are consistent with a good and loving God.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would agree with that, but I'm just trying to use language I think maybe more.
Yeah, no, that's perfect.
useful
That's
that-
great.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad that we could discuss this in 2 minutes what it took 20 minutes the other.
Well, Danny's going to say he thinks the whole project is kind of incoherent.
Well,
but
he's saying that he's saying that if we're going to say that God actualizes states of affairs that are according to his nature, that if God is going to like actualize a world where there is, let's say, bad things, you're going to say those are pro toto evil, then that is inconsistent with God's nature.
Wait, what's pro toto evil?
If there is a world, like if there were a world
yeah.
where there were pro toto evils, like all in all bad, that would be inconsistent with God's nature to actualize it. So God would not actualize that. But you and I would probably contend. I mean, I don't know if you would, but I'm contending that we can't ever, at least from what we observe, we really have no justification for saying there are in fact pro toto evils. At least
Yeah, that's an epistemological objection that I think.
Yeah, and Danny agrees with that.
Yeah, Danny agrees with it. So I mean, we could just stop there because the epistemological objection runs. But I think that there are underlying metaphysical problems with what Danny is saying as well, because I think there's metaphysical confusion.
Look, I think it makes a lot of sense. I don't know why you're going on non-cognitivist here, but like when Jonah goes to heaven and says, finds out.
I actually have to run now because I put this off a lot. Go ahead and say your last thing, but then after that, I got to run.
I just think if Jonah went to heaven and then found out that it was all according to God's plan, okay, that he disobeyed, and the idea is he's going to form the belief that that's God's plan is the highest good. That's what should occur, and he's going to reflect, think about, well, would it have been better, or would have been a better world if I had done differently? He's going to think no, because then God's plan would have not been realized, and then he's going to say, well, thank God I did what I did, right?
Well, no, your conclusion is, therefore, I did the right thing by disobeying God.
The conclusion is that he's going to form the belief that he should not have done differently.
Yeah, should. When you say should, you mean ought, right? And so his conclusion in heaven, based on what you said, is going to be, cool, I did the right thing in disobeying God.
But how are you divorcing the right thing from what should?
I'm identifying them. We're saying the same thing. When you say that he will acknowledge that he should have disobeyed God, that's synonymous with saying he will agree that he did the right thing in disobeying God.
Okay, I have a question. Do you think that
I gotta run, dude. I really do.
Okay, go ahead.
Well,
I appreciate this is a great conversation.
Yes, it is. But can we pick it up another? Because Blake, I feel like I hope we can start it over. Not start completely over. Like actually start where we're at here and actually get to the end. Because I feel like
what I thought. I'm wondering if you feel similarly or if you feel differently.
I mean, there's some stuff I'm going to read that Blake mentioned, but yeah, by and large, it's a little frustrating to talk to Blake because he does this. I mean, I don't know. I probably just don't have enough understanding of philosophy. I just don't understand philosophy to understand what he's saying sometimes. And so, like, a seemingly simple question like, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
Danny said that Danny asked him, that Blake said that he didn't understand what Danny meant when Danny said that God's plan should be realized.
That's right.
Yeah, I don't understand why that's a hard question, but maybe there's some sort of angle to it.
That just sounds insane.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, as a Christian, the answer should be yes. God's plan should come to fruition because that's
yeah,
how we define something good.
Yeah, it's hard to think of anything that for a Christian.
Did he say that though?
Well, I may not have understood. Maybe you misunderstood what you're saying. I don't know. Maybe you misunderstood what you're
Yeah,
saying.
no, he said it. He said it for sure. It was not a misunderstanding.
Here's what Danny wrote me verbatim. He said that he didn't know what it meant to say, quote, God's plan should occur.
That's right.
Yeah. So I don't see how somebody saying something like that is going to be able to offer you anything.
Maybe what he meant by not knowing what he means by should occur, maybe he's trying to figure out if you mean there's something guiding God or if God
What
didn't
does it mean to say? What does it mean to say? Well, I don't know. I think that sentence was gibberish. But Andrew, I really want to talk to him now that I've like sobered up and I'm letting him drink like heavily. I want to like talk to him, but nobody wants me up.
I'm just throwing out because Blake is usually pretty smart and he normally answers questions directly. But I think maybe that was what he was pausing for, is he wanted somebody to clarify. When you say God's plan should come to pass, are you saying that like there's a cause that God has to do it, or that God can change his plan?
That's actually a really good question, James, because I don't know what the fuck it means to say a state of affairs should occur. Should pertains to action. What does it mean to say a state of affairs should occur? That's
I mean, ought to occur.
It's just going to mean.
Ought to occur.
It's just going to mean that some feature.
Ought and should are synonymous.
It's just going to mean that there's some reason providing feature in the state of affairs such that one ought to actualize. Because we're talking about God's plan, right? So we are talking about an action. Should God?
Yes, what you mean is, yeah, no, I get you. What you're saying is, if God plans something, what that means is there's some intentional state that God has, and God then has a reason to act upon.
That's right. Yeah. For any agent, right? If it's up to them to bring that plan to fruition, right, then they ought to.
I appreciate that
Honestly,
you're
that makes
breaking
sense,
this
but
down, but like
I
for
think
real,
it's better
what
to
this is not
explain
a
it.
complicated. Why I'm trying to talk. Why like that was weird though, right? Like we don't need to break down the semantics there. Like Blake not knowing how to answer that question is bizarre. Like I don't know why you would get tripped up on that. It seems just intuitively you would say yes.
He knows, but that's the issue with like the problem with people. You either have to like take some really uncomfortable position like the one that Blake did, or you just have to say that God doesn't exist, and it looks like Blake took the uncomfortable position.